A couple of days ago, I published a video about the possibility of new serious felony charges against Elizabeth Siders. And I asked the question, serious compared to what? Well, now we know the answer. And those new, even more egregious allegations raise an even harder question. If Elizabeth is ultimately found responsible for them, can she still also be a victim herself? Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Motive and Method. My name is Stina. If you're new here, my background is in communication. I have a bachelor's degree in communication, graduated magna cum laude with departmental honors, and I have more than 25 years of professional experience in written and verbal communication. I'm not an attorney or a psychologist. What I do here is look closely at language, framing, patterns, contradictions, and the assumptions we sometimes make when we're trying to understand human behavior. Before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. Elizabeth Siders has pleaded not guilty and is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. The allegations we're discussing are extremely serious. And because this case involves young people, I'm generally going to refer to them as minors or little ones. That is not meant to minimize what they experience. It's simply a way to discuss this subject without creating unnecessary problems with YouTube. And before we get into it, if you appreciate this kind of analysis, please like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to support Motive and Method more directly, we also have channel memberships and merch. All right, let's talk about Elizabeth. If you're new to this case, let me give you the short version. On June 30th, 2026, authorities went to the Siders property in Vinton County, Ohio, initially in connection with an investigation involving Gary Siders Jr. While they were there, authorities say they discovered 16 minors living in conditions that led to child endangering charges against 4 adults: Gary Siders Sr., Christina Siders, Gary Siders Jr., and Elizabeth Siders. Authorities also executed a second search warrant at the property that same day. At the time, very little was publicly disclosed about what that second warrant involved. So, from the beginning, there was a piece of this investigation that we knew existed, but we didn't know exactly what it was about. And now, with the new indictments returned on August 21st, we know considerably more. A Vinton County grand jury returned new indictments involving Elizabeth Siders and the other adults in this case. Elizabeth is now facing 19 child endangering charges related to the conditions authorities say the 16 minors were living in. And in a separate case, she was indicted on 2 counts of sexual battery and 2 counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. Those allegations involve a minor who authorities say was not part of Elizabeth and Gary Jr.'s immediate family. Again, these are allegations, not convictions. But they make the question I want to ask today much harder. Is it still possible that Elizabeth Siders is also a victim? And I already know what some people may be thinking. Here comes the abuse excuse. So let's talk about that. We've all heard some version of it. Someone is accused of doing something terrible, and then we learn they experienced abuse as a child. And somebody says, here comes the abuse excuse. I completely understand that reaction. Childhood trauma can help explain later behavior, but it does not erase the harm someone may cause. One of my channel members put it really well. She said, and I quote, "Motivation is not an excuse." When people say that's just the abuse excuse, they're missing the point. Understanding the motivation behind a behavior isn't excusing it. It is explaining it. That distinction matters. But ongoing coercive control is a different kind of situation because now we're talking about someone who may be living under active control, intimidation, threat, or domination while those decisions are being made. That did not automatically remove responsibility, not at all, but it can change the context in which those choices happen. And there is research that helps explain it. Let's look at some of what the research actually shows. Coercive control is not simply somebody being bossy. It is a pattern of behavior meant to dominate another person through things like isolation, monitoring, intimidation, restriction, and threat. Over time, the person being controlled may begin making decisions around one central question: what happens if I don't comply? This is often called the fawn response, a survival strategy where the nervous system chooses appeasement and compliance to avoid harm. I actually experienced coercive control growing up, and the fawn response became my default for years. I'd stay quiet, keep the peace, and try to stay useful because it felt like the safest option. And something I still have to consciously manage even today. Once someone has lived with repeated threats, violence, or unpredictable cruelty, their brain can learn that staying obedient is the safest choice. And that matters because the threat doesn't have to be spoken every single time. The expectation of consequences becomes part of the control itself. Research has also linked coercive control with significant psychological effects, including PTSD and depression. And there is research specifically involving women who committed crimes alongside male partners. One study of 50 incarcerated women found high levels of physical and psychological coercion by male co-defendants, ranging from manipulation to direct physical coercion used to gain compliance with criminal activity. And that brings us to an important point. Victim and offender are not always mutually exclusive categories. Sometimes they overlap. Now, let's bring this back to Elizabeth. Everything I've shared about coercive control is based on research, and there are many studies about the effects of coercive control. What we don't know is whether that's what happened here with Elizabeth. But there are facts about Elizabeth's life that make the question worth asking. Elizabeth was only 15 years old and pregnant when she married Gary Jr., who was 18. Their first child was born just 2 months later. And over the next 17 years, she would give birth to 18 children. Let that sink in for a second. She never really got to be a teenager. She went straight from being a pregnant 15-year-old girl to being a wife and mother. And she stayed in that role, pregnant or postpartum, for nearly 2 decades. That's not normal. That's not what most girls' lives look like. None of this proves she was being controlled. It doesn't prove she was abused. But when you look at the conditions authorities eventually found in that house, I don't think we can honestly talk about what happened without acknowledging how her life began and how much it was spent pregnant, exhausted, and completely immersed in that family. She didn't walk into this as the 33-year-old woman we see in the mugshot. She walked into it as a scared, pregnant, 15-year-old girl. And given everything we know about coercive control, I think it is fair to ask what those 18 years actually look like for her. Now, let's take the hardest version of this question. What if the evidence eventually shows that Elizabeth actively participated in the harm? Would that automatically mean she could not also have been a victim? No, it doesn't. One of the biggest misconceptions about abuse is that a victim must appear completely powerless at all times. But someone can have agency in some moments and still be living under coercive control in others. Active participation does not automatically disprove the presence of coercion. At the same time, the reverse is equally true. Victimhood does not erase culpability. If Elizabeth knowingly harmed those little ones, no amount of abuse she may have suffered would excuse that harm or make accountability unnecessary. Both things can be true at the same time. And this is where I keep coming back to one of my favorite concepts. Elizabeth could potentially be a victim of coercive control and still be responsible for harm. Recognizing one does not erase the other. We can have compassion for what may have happened to Elizabeth without taking anything away from the minors at the center of this case. And right now, we simply do not know enough to say exactly what that dynamic was. More evidence may support the possibility of coercive control, or it may not. That's why the evidence matters, and why allegations are not convictions. So, when somebody asks me, is Elizabeth Siders a victim? My answer right now is, I don't know. But I do think it's a question worth asking. Asking that question does not excuse anything Elizabeth is accused of doing. It simply means we are willing to consider the possibility that a person can be both harmed and responsible for harm. Now, I want to know what you guys think. Can someone be both a victim and an offender? And if evidence eventually shows that Elizabeth was living under coercive control, how, if at all, should that change the way we understand her role in this case? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, but please keep the conversation respectful. No personal attacks on me or others. If you found this discussion worthwhile, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support Motive and Method further, you can check out the channel memberships and the merch store. And remember, words matter. Listen closely. I'll see you next time.